in the drama, you don't observe it from the distance, you live it as part of the story. Okay, that's our fourth background point. Now, fifthly and finally, transferred classicism. This is a term that Lewis coined when he was writing about that technique that Christian writers adopted up until the 17th century, when they were wanting to say something about Christianity, but would do so by reaching back into the pagan past, into Greek and Roman mythology particularly, finding there Jupiter, Zeus, Venus, other gods and goddesses. They would transfer those characters into their own play, their own poem, and under the veil of those pagan characters, they would say something about Christianity. Paganism, Lewis says, is the religion of much medieval and Renaissance poetry, through which the author can express at any moment just so much or so little of his real religion, of his Christianity, as his art requires, and everyone is in secret. Everybody knew that when the playwright or the poet was talking about Zeus, he was really talking about the Christian god, but it was a convenient fiction. It's the best way, Lewis says, of writing literature which is religious without being devotional. You can explore religious themes, but you don't get caught up into questions of your own personal spirituality. You can see them at somewhat of a distance. So God, the Christian God, Lewis says, often appears in medieval writings, but masked under a pagan veil, incognito. And in a sense, what Lewis is doing has a kind of biblical precedent in what we see St. Paul doing in the book of Acts, when, you remember, he preaches to the Athenians, quoting pagan poets. God is not far from each one of us, Paul says, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. In Zeus we live and move and have our being, is what the original said. For we are indeed Zeus's offspring. Now, of course, Paul isn't advising the Athenians to worship Zeus. He's just taking their knowledge of Zeus and transferring it into his presentation of the Christian gospel. And that's somewhat similar to what the medieval writers would do many centuries later. Okay, so those are our 5 background reasons. We're now back where we started, how the Narnia books hold together. But let's just recap those 5. Lewis's secrecy, his capacity for keeping secrets when he wanted to. His belief in enjoyment consciousness. One whole mode of our conscious existence involved in visibility or hiddenness when we're inside an experience. A theological equivalent of that in this Christ-drenched universe. A literary equivalent of that in a well-told story full of atmosphere and pervasive weather. And then transfer classicism, hiding God behind a pagan veil. Those are our 5 background points, and we're now equipped to understand what Lewis was up to in the Narnia Chronicles, I hope. And at this point, it's worth reminding ourselves that although Lewis is best known for the Narnia Chronicles, he wasn't professionally a writer of fiction. He was professionally an academic who taught at Oxford for 30 years, finished his career at Cambridge. The biggest book he ever wrote was English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. A snappy title, if ever there was one. Can I do another survey and ask you, you all have read Narnia, how many of you have read this one? Oh, marvellous. 2, 3, 4. No, come on, you're just having me on. 5, really? Excellent. That's very impressive. This book was part of a multi-volume series of books about the history of English literature. The history of English literature, which Lewis abbreviated to OHL. He called this his OHL volume. And it took him 15 years to write, and when he published it, he wrote to a friend and said, I finally finished this big academic work I've been engaged in for the last decade and a half. And then he interestingly adds, it was the top tune all those years. And all the other books I published during that time were just its little twiddly bits. Which means Narnia, and the Screwtape Letters, and Mere Christianity, and so many other works, for which Lewis is now much better known than this, were, to him, the little twiddly bits upon this top tune. This was the main theme. This is what he was paid to think about. This is what he got up in the morning thinking that he would work on next. This was his career. Narnia and Screwtape and those other works were just things he did in his leisure hours. The twiddly bits, the ornamental details, the little piccolo flourishes, the tings on the triangle. So if we think of Lewis primarily as the author of Narnia and only secondarily as the writer of this kind of work, we get it entirely back to front. We mistake the twiddly bits for the main theme. This is the main theme. And if ever you do read this book, which I would encourage you to do, it's actually very readable, you will find that it opens with a long discussion of this chap, Nicholas Copernicus, and the new astronomy that he brought in the middle of the 16th century. In, I think, 1546, he published his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, in which he argued for a heliocentric view of the cosmos, a sun-centered view of the cosmos, not a geocentric, not an Earth-centered view. Until Copernicus, everyone had believed that that the Earth was at the center of the universe. The Earth was static and central, surrounded by a series of concentric spheres, each sphere with its own planet, and each planet with its own set of influences and attributes that it would shed upon the Earth. And Lewis was interested in the Copernican revolution in astronomy, which removed the Earth from the center, put it at the edge, and replaced it with the sun. That was a very big change in the history of human thought. Single-handedly, Copernicus relocated Earth. We had thought we were at the middle. He showed us that we are at the edge. So, Copernicus is kind of a deal. Lewis certainly thought so. That's why he opens his study of the 16th century with the Copernican revolution. He wanted to see how it played out in the literature of the period. Because, of course, the kind of cosmos you believe yourself to be living in will have a major effect upon the kind of story that you write about yourself and your place in the world. And it's a theme that Lewis returns to in his last academic book, The Discarded Image. 3 times in this book, Lewis encourages his readers to take a walk under the sky at night, trying to imagine themselves back into a medieval mindset, trying to imagine that they really believed that the Earth was central and static and surrounded by always moving planets. Look up at the night sky these days, Lewis says, and you think you're looking up into a trackless waste, a vast black vacuity. But back in pre-Copernican times, you would have felt you were looking up into the heavens. A series of ranked crystalline spheres, each with its own planet. The first of them being the sphere of the moon, then that of Mercury, then that of Venus. Then in the brightest heaven of invention, the sun. The sun, remember, was a planet, according to this old astronomy. Then Mars, then Jupiter. Finally, in the 7th heaven, Saturn. Still today, occasionally, you hear people saying, "Oh, I was in the 7th heaven of delight." And what does that mean? It means you're up there, furthest away from Earth and all its trials and tribulations. You're getting close to being in the very home of God. If you keep going, you will pass through the sphere of the fixed stars. Planets are wandering stars. And eventually, you will emerge into the home of God. This is a more detailed diagram of the cosmos as it was believed to be. And this was hard, established, scientific fact, until Copernicus blew it out of the water with his heliocentric theory which was later confirmed by Kepler and Galileo when the telescope was invented in the early 17th century. So these are the 7 heavens, these are the 7 planets. These are what could be seen with the naked eye. This is long before astronomers had observed Uranus or Neptune, let alone the ill-fated Pluto. Pluto, who was a planet for, what, 70 years or something, before he was relegated to the 2nd division as a dwarf planet. Poor old Pluto. But Lewis wanted his readers and his students to be aware of this old cosmos because it was everywhere presupposed in medieval literature. This is the image that he's talking about in the title of his book, the discarded image. This is the image we've discarded. We've thrown this out. We no longer believe the universe to be like this. Except in perhaps one respect, because of course we still refer to this every day of our lives, though we have forgotten it, in the names we use for the days of the week. What is today? Thursday? So, if that is Thor's day, and Thor is the Norse equivalent of Jove, Jupiter, think of it in Spanish, Creves. Tomorrow will be the day of Freya, the Norse equivalent of the Roman Venus, Viennes. Then we come to the day of Saturn, the day of the sun, the day of the moon, and so on. So we still retain aspects of this image, even though in every other respect we have discarded it. But of course the medievals hadn't discarded it. It was still very much their view of the cosmos. And in medieval literature, Dante is perhaps the greatest user of this cosmological idea in his own literature. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the pilgrim mounts up through the 7 heavens in his ascent to God's throne. Now here's an illustration from an edition of the Divine Comedy, showing you the 7 planetary characters in the order of the days of the week. So there on the left you have the sun in his burning fiery chariot. Here is the moon in her silvery gown, holding her crescent. Then we come to Mars with his helmet and his chainmail. Mars is associated with war. Then Mercury. We know he's Mercury because of these wings on his heels. Mercury is the messenger. Then we come to Jupiter. We know he's Jupiter because of that rod that he's holding over his shoulder. That is not just any old stick, it's a scepter. It's the royal staff of office, because Jupiter was associated symbolically with all things regal and royal. Then we have Venus in her green gown. Venus associated with fertility, creativity, laughter, love, sexuality. Traces of Venus and her influence still linger in our language. When we venerate someone, when we lovingly respect someone, we're doing something under the influence of Venus. That's where the word venerate comes from. I won't go into material, but that's probably another thing we do under the influence of Venus. And here, finally, we have Saturn with that sickle, that scythe. Saturn is associated with death and disaster, cutting people down in their prime. He's the same character, mythologically speaking, as Father Time, Lewis points out. Okay, so this is one way in which the medieval writers used the 7 heavens. Dante in the Divine Comedy. Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, also uses it all over his poetry. And here's a page of notes that I found in C.S. Lewis's handwriting. He's making notes about Chaucer's Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. And Lewis says that he admires the way Chaucer uses the planets in the Knight's Tale, because he doesn't just put them into the story as actors in the drama, but he weaves the appropriate influences of the planets into the plot, so that the climax of the Knight's Tale happens on a Tuesday, on Martes, the day of Mars. How appropriate for a story about knights. So Lewis has this academic and literary interest in the use of the seven heavens. We've already pointed out how he loved Psalm 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God. He had this kind of devotional or spiritual connection to the heavens too. He was quite a keen amateur astronomer, actually. He liked going into the local observatory in Oxford. He had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. He would often point out unusual conjunctions of the planets in the night sky. We know this from his letters and his recorded conversations. And he also responded to it at a more imaginative level. He wrote a series of books all about planetary adventure. This trilogy, the Cosmic Trilogy, or the Space Trilogy as it's sometimes called, the Ransom Trilogy, is first of all set on Mars, a very medieval Mars. Then it goes to Venus, very medieval Venus. And in the third book, which is set on Earth, the planetary characters actually come down to Earth to bring about the end of the story. You can't miss his use of the planets in these books. It's all very obvious and at the forefront. Why was he so interested? Well, he said this: the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn, we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, Jupiter? So these are no small claims. He's not saying, oh, this is just for the medievals. No, he's saying these planets have a permanent value as spiritual symbols. And indeed, they're especially worthwhile in our own generation, because Lewis's generation, remember, was the generation that went through the First World War. Lewis himself had been a teenage officer in the British Army in the First World War. As a 19-year-old, he'd arrived in the French trenches, and he'd served for about 6 months before he was blown up by a shell that fell in his trench, obliterating the man next to him, spattering Lewis full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for the rest of his life, very nearly killing him. That's why he says of Saturn we know more than enough. Of people being cut down with a sickle, we know more than enough. And he would sometimes refer to the character of the culture in the 1920s as Saturnocentric, fixated upon Saturn and qualities of death and loss and pessimism and cynicism. A very understandable reaction to the Great War, which everyone had just been through. But also, he thought, a historical accident. This Saturnocentricity was unwarranted. It wasn't an eternal truth about the nature of the universe. It was a historical accident. And a much better way of symbolizing the heart of spiritual reality was through the imagery of Jove. Who does not need to be reminded of Jupiter, the king? So, I believe that when Lewis came to write the Narnia books, he used this sevenfold symbolic scheme again. He had used it in the trilogy explicitly. Here in Narnia, he uses it implicitly. He takes one planet per book and turns all those planetary characteristics and attributes into a story. He uses it to control the way that Aslan is portrayed in each book. He uses it to control the way the children interact with Aslan in each book. And he uses it also to pervade and colour all through and through every other aspect of the story, the ornamental background details, so that the whole story coheres with this one resonant spiritual symbol. That's the unified design and blueprint to the Narnia Chronicles. Now, we don't have time to go through all 7 books, but let me just very quickly, if I may, summarize for you how I think this works out with the first 3 books in the order of publication. So we start out with Jove. Who does not need to be reminded of Jupiter? Here is Jupiter the planet. Here in the southeast corner, you can just make out the great red spot of Jupiter. That's Jupiter's great red eye. A storm perpetually raging on the surface of Jupiter, and the diameter of that eye is greater than the diameter of Earth. You could fit the whole of our planet inside that little red spot. Shows you how massive Jupiter is. And here is Jupiter, the king of the gods. Jupiter in Roman, Zeus in Greek, Thor in Norse mythology. Now, we return to that moment. 11:30 one night in February 2003, it's 12 years ago now that I had this idea. I was just about to turn out my light, and I thought, no, I'll stay up a little bit longer and read Lewis's poem, The Planets. A long, complicated poem he wrote all about the seven heavens, 15 years before he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I'm reading this poem, and I get to the lines about Jupiter. And then I read these words. Of wrath ended and woes mended, winter past and guilt forgiven, and good fortune, Jove is master. I do a double take. Winter past and guilt forgiven. I've come across that in another of Lewis's works. That seems like a very good 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is all about the passing of winter. You remember the White Witch? She's made it always winter, but never Christmas. Her kingdom of ice and snow is defeated at the coming of Aslan. And it's all about the forgiving of guilt, too. Edmund, the treacherous Edmund, who betrays his brother and his sisters. His guilt is forgiven. How interesting, I think to myself. So I look more closely at the imagery associated with Jupiter in this poem, and a great deal of the imagery in the poem links up with imagery in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Principally, of course, kingliness. That's Jupiter's main quality. He's the monarch, he's the sovereign. And think how Aslan is introduced in that first story. The children don't know who he is in that first book, but they're told he is the king. That's the very first description given of Aslan. He's the king of the wood. He's not safe, but he's good. He is the king. And he's repeatedly described throughout the rest of the tale as royal and solemn. He's got a kingly crown, a royal standard, a royal pavilion. And of course he ends up crowning the children too. They too become kings and queens. Aslan says at the end of the story, once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia. You remember the very first time the children all get into the wardrobe, they find these fur coats, they put them on. And we're told that the coats looked more like royal robes than coats when they put them on. This is a little signal of where the story is going to culminate in the grand coronation scene at the end of the tale. The children become kingly as they relate to the kingly Aslan. Okay, so we've got the passing of winter, the kingly theme, and the forgiving of guilt, yes. But how is the guilt forgiven? It's forgiven by Aslan dying on the stone table and coming back to life, in a very obvious reimagining of Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection. What's that got to do with Jupiter? Sure, that can't have anything to do with Jove. Well, it didn't take much digging to realize that in the same year that Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he published another book on the poetry of his great friend Charles Williams, one of the Inklings. And in that book, Lewis writes this: when Charles Williams writes of Jupiter's red-pierced planet, he assumes that the huge reddish spot which astronomers observe on the surface of Jupiter is a wound, and the redness is that of blood. Jupiter, the planet of kingship, thus wounded, becomes another archetype, another shadow or reflection of the divine king wounded on Calvary. So we see here very explicit evidence of how Lewis connects the kingliness of Jupiter with the kingliness of Christ through sacrificial blood. Here's a medieval woodcut showing you Jupiter enthroned in the heavens, and down on earth are the people who exhibit his influence. So there on the right you have a coronation scene. In the middle ground on the left you can just make out a man kneeling for judgment before a judge. Is his guilt going to be forgiven or not? And in the background you might just be able to notice horses and hounds hunting a white stag, the white hart, the noblest quarry that kings and queens would hunt for in medieval romances. And you may remember the final chapter of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is entitled The Hunting of the White Stag. All these jovial, these Jupiterish elements find their way into The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Surely this is not by accident. But let's, for the sake of argument, assume it is an accident and turn to Prince Caspian and see how this is also very strangely connected to the imagery of one of the seven heavens. In this case, the imagery of Mars. Prince Caspian, I believe, is the martial story. Mars is the god of war. We all know that. And Prince Caspian is a war story. It's the civil war of Narnia. It's the great war of deliverance, as it's called. And if you saw the recent film version, you will remember the military battles scenes in that film. They really went to town on all those martial elements. Yes, but you might say that there are battles in quite a few of the Narnia books. So what makes this one particularly martial? It's partly the centrality of these battles. It's partly that the very word martial appears a couple of times. But what clinches it is something that has nothing to do with battles and military imagery, but everything to do with trees. You see the trees on the cover of the book. You remember how Lucy tries to wake the trees. The Telmarines are frightened of the forest. The trees come to the battle at the end of the book. Why all these trees? Is it just evidence of Lewis throwing things together any old how? No, it's a key component of the martial quality which he, as a very well-educated classicist, knew from childhood. I had no knowledge of this until I began digging, but in classical mythology, Mars had two main qualities. He was, yes, the god of war, with his shield, his spear, his helmet, but he was also the god of trees and forests. He was known as Mars Silvanus. And this image from Pompeii shows you Mars in those two capacities, god of war, but god of sylvans as well. The month of March is sacred to Mars. That's why we call it March. Because in the month of March, the weather is becoming good enough for armies to march off to battle, but also the trees are coming to life after winter. So here is an image from Prince Caspian showing you, again, those two influences in one image. We have the single combat in the foreground. It's overseen by the Sylvans, the Dryads, the Hamadryads, all these forest characters that Lewis packs the story with. Aslan sums up the martial quality in his own person. He's the one who gives the great war cry, summoning everyone to the final battle. He's the Lord of hosts, mighty in battle, you might say, using biblical terminology. But he's also the one in whose presence the trees come alive. He can wake the trees, though Lucy cannot. The boys in the story harden into knights as the story progresses, and the girls romp in the bacchanalian revelry with the swaying trees and the growing vines. The children participate in Aslan's martial attributes, and even seemingly unimportant details like the little chess piece that they discover in the ruins of the castle at the start of the tale. Even that contributes to the overall atmosphere, because that chess piece is what? It's not a king, it's not a pawn, it's not a bishop, it's a knight. Of course, it has to be a chess knight with a little red ruby eye, because knighthood, chivalry, gallantry, all things martial are the central meaning of Prince Caspian. Just like Chaucer had woven the influences of Mars into the Knight's Tale, so Lewis does the same here in Prince Caspian. More quickly now, the Dawn Treader is the sun story. You could really guess this from the title of the tale alone, because this is a story about a journey towards the dawn, the place of the rising sun. And when the children encounter Aslan at the eastern edge of the world, we're told that he scatters light from his mane. Lucy, earlier on, has seen Aslan flying in a sunbeam when they get caught on the dark island. And on Goldwater Island, Deathwater Island, as they later call it, they come across this magic pool that turns things to gold. They begin to squabble about who's going to take possession of this island, or this pool, until suddenly they are shamed into silence by the appearance of Aslan on the hillside, and we're told that Aslan is shining as if in bright sunlight, though the sun had in fact gone in. Because Aslan in this story is figured by means of solar imagery. He is, as Jesus says in the Gospel of John, he is the light of the world. Gold imagery, imagery of illumination are everywhere in this tale. But again, what pinches it is another theme that has nothing very obviously to do with the sun, unless you have a classical education. And that is the theme of dragons. The ship itself is shaped like a dragon. You remember how Eustace is turned into a dragon. They meet a great sea serpent. There are loads of dragons in this tale. Why? Just Lewis throwing things together any old how? No, it's part of the solar scheme out of which the whole book is composed. Because in Greek mythology, the god of light was Apollo. And if you know your Homer, Homer's hymn to Apollo talks all about the way Apollo slays a dragon. He was called Apollo Sauroctonus, the lizard slayer, the dragon slayer. And here is Apollo in that capacity. He's looking at that miniature dragon, that lizard, and he's killing it with the beams of his eyes. So here is a still from the recent film version. This is Eustace's eyeball after he's been turned into a dragon. And there in the reflection in his eyeball, you can see the approaching form of Aslan. Aslan is going to come along and rip off the thick, dark, knobbly dragon skin and turn Eustace back into a boy again. This episode isn't just a convenient metaphor for conversion. It's part and parcel of the total solar symbolism out of which the whole book is constructed. Let me just list for you the remaining tales. The Silver Chair is the moon story, I believe. Again, you might guess that from the title, because moon and silver are so obviously connected. Here is the moon goddess Cynthia driving her chariot across the heavens. In The Horse and His Boy, we have the Mercurial story, the Mercury tale, in which Aslan is swift of foot, like Mercury, with wings on his heel. In The Magician's Nephew, we have the Venus story, full of creativity, fertility, motherliness, beautiful women, and magic apples taken from Western gardens. The garden of the Hesperides is associated with Africa.